On today's Locked On Jayhawks, we preview Kansas NC State. Do or die time for Kansas about as early in the season as you could need a win.
You are Locked On Jayhawks, your daily podcast on the Kansas Jayhawks. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, Derek Johnson here. This is Locked On Jayhawks. Thanks for making it your first listen every day. Thank you to the everydayers catching each and every episode. And thank you if you're tuning in for the first time. We're free and available wherever you get your podcasts, including on YouTube. Like and subscribe to the show. Give us a little thumbs up if you could. 5-star if you're listening on a podcast. Certainly helps us out on our end of things. And thank you for being loyal listeners along the way. We're going to be previewing Kansas NC State on today's episode of the show, coming at you on Saturday. We're going to get into the top headlines for the game. We're going to get into the NC State scouting report, matchups, players to watch, all that on today's episode of Locked On Jayhawks. First, this episode is brought to you by Game Time, where you can get some tickets to the KU-NC State game. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase with Game Time. So Kansas takes on NC State on Saturday, and I think the first headline of this one is just Kansas trying to bounce back. This was a bit of a headline, I guess you could say, for the last game, but now it becomes even more dire, more apparent because, you know, if you lose at home and it's a third straight loss, I mean, it already feels like there's a bit of like skies falling mentality going on right now from some. I can't imagine what it'll be if that specifically happens. And if you do lose it, I mean, losing at home as well. And when I look at it, like, this is an opportunity for Kansas to get better. You have some upcoming home games where you clearly have been more comfortable these last two seasons, and you have some extra time off in between for practice. Now, that said, it's not as much practice time as the schedule might look, right? You play a 1-week game this week against NC State, then you have a 1-week game the following week against Brown, then you're off until you play West Virginia. So it's like, oh, you have 3 games in, I guess if we go back to last Sunday, in over a 20-day span. It's like you should have plenty of time to practice. But then you start thinking about it, it's like, I think this week's finals week, so they might not be going as hard. You think about the week in between the Brown game and the West Virginia game, like people are going to be traveling away, Christmas, this and that. It's not going to be as much practice time as you think, but still, there is more practice time during this, I guess, 3-week stretch than there probably will be again at any point during the season, and there probably was up until before the season started. So if ever you were going to get better, if ever you are going to start, ironing out roles, figuring things out, playing with that pride and effort and energy, it's going to be coming off 2 straight losses, playing at home against a team that NC State, isn't an elite team this year, but they're at least a power opponent that made the Final Four last season. You should be pumped up to play this game coming off those losses, and you've had extra practice time to try to figure stuff out. If ever Kansas is going to look like, a team that we expect to do big things. And I shouldn't say if ever, because they did when they beat Duke, right? You have some big wins early in the season. But if ever you are going to turn the ship around, so to speak, it'll be right here in a game like this. Now, you look at NC State coming into this one, they are 7-3 on the season, but 6 of those 7 wins are against teams who are ranked outside of the top 200 on KenPom. So again, can't really take as much away from some of the stats here, but they do have a couple of games against, decent opponents. And the lone solid win was against a Florida State team who's ranked in like the mid 60s on KenPom to this point in time. And they ended up winning that one by 10 points, though the final margin probably not as indicative of how close the game was because it was an overtime game that they pulled away in overtime. But every other top 100 opponent that they've played have all been top 50 opponents, and they lost. They lost by 10 points on a neutral floor to Purdue, which, Purdue's a pretty good team, so I guess losing on 10 on a neutral isn't, that much to be ashamed about. BYU, they lost by 11 on a neutral court, and then they lost by 4 points at home to Texas. So you look at NC State, I just think they're kind of a solid team that I don't know that I'm expecting to make the NCAA tournament, but, they are closer to that on Bart Torvik, where they are inside the top 60. Personnel of note for the Wolfpack, 6'2" guard Michael O'Connell. He's the main point guard, 6.8 points per game, 4.2 assists per game, only 32% from 3, but he's kind of been a good game managing point guard for them. Marcus Hill is a 6'4" guard. They play 2 6'4" guards at the 2 and the 3. And really, it's a 3-guard lineup for them. So KU last game started David Coit and Zeke Mayo. If you're just matching up stylistically, then maybe you see a lot of that in this game. I know part of that was fueled by some bad practices for like AJ Storr and Rylan Griffen. We'll see what the impact is there. But with Marcus Hill, he's at the 2 and the 3 for them. He averages 13 points per game, 3 rebounds, 53%. So he's been a very efficient player, but low volume, low percentage from 3. So more of a slasher in how he's been able to get it done. Jaden Taylor, he plays a similar spot, 6'4" guard, 12.5 points per game, 3 rebounds, 1.5 steals per game, low volume shooting, 26% from 3-point range, but again, can get buckets in other ways. Then they have a 6'6" wing in Dontrez Styles. He averages 10.6 points, 4.7 rebounds, 1.1 block. He's doing all that in 24 minutes per game. So, I mean, the production they're getting from him in that many minutes is very impressive. And he's doing it very efficiently. 48% from the field, 38% from 3, 77% at the foul line. I could argue he's their best offensive player. Defensively, it tells a different story if you look at like some of the metric sides or you look at like an Evan Miyakawa. But at the very least, he is producing at a high level on good efficiency on offense. And he is getting over a block per game to his credit on that defensive end of the court. It's a pretty even rotation of centers between 2 guys. Brandon Huntley Hatfield, he's a 6'10", 240-pound center. I believe he was a former 5-star that went to like Tennessee or something. And then they have a 6'10", 240-pound center in Ben Middlebrooks. How perfect is that? They have 2 centers who are the same height and weight. That's awesome. They're both around 9 points per game. Huntley Hatfield has been the better rebounder so far, but Middlebrooks has been the much better defender so far. Middlebrooks has actually been like a really good defender just in general. 1.6 blocks per game, 1.2 steals per game. He's doing both of those in just 19 minutes per game. So, I mean, if you prorated those stats out, if he was getting 28 minutes per game, you'd be looking at 2.5 blocks, 2 steals per game. And he is somebody who rates very well on some of the metric sites in terms of his defensive ratings. Both are over 50% from the floor. They're combined 4 of 11 from 3. So that basically tells you they'll launch up 1 or 2 per game between the 2 of them. They might make it, but you probably just live with it if you're Kansas, not expecting them to take 3 or 4. That could kind of change the game. Also look out on the bench, Breon Pass. He's a 6-foot senior guard who's shooting 47% from 3. He comes in to shoot. And what do we know about players or teams when they come into Allen Fieldhouse? It's usually the guys who come in off the bench or something like that, guys who are ready to just launch from 3. They usually do pretty well against KU. So watch out for him. Dennis Parker is a 6'6" wing. He kind of spells Styles, low usage stats, though. He's 4 of 10 from 3, so he's at least been good there in low usage. Now, what they've done well, they don't turn the ball over. They get to the free throw line at a solid rate, and that one is certainly interesting because KU has fouled teams too much. And we talked about this in the top 5 issues for KU basketball right now, that they need to do a better job of getting to the line themselves and preventing teams from getting there. So that'll be tough in this matchup to do. They also force a ton of turnovers as NC State. There have been a lot of years where NC State has thrown out, a press or full court man-to-man and tried to turn you over, tried to speed the game up. They like to make it fast. They like to get out in transition, scoring offensively. That's somewhere else that they kind of excel. And a part of that, too, is they get a ton of turnovers. They get steals. They get blocks. They've also been an elite 3-point defense. We talk about this all the time. How much of that is luck, especially through just 10 games? How much of that is planned? I will say, you look at the number of threes their opponents are attempting against them. It's a low number, which kind of tells me that maybe they are chasing teams off the 3-point line, that they're chasing teams off the 3-point line, so therefore they're not shooting as many threes. So, of course, they're not going to shoot as many high percentage of them because they're just not as good of shots. So that will be interesting in this one, or if it is just kind of a mirage through the first 10 games and they're due for a reversion to the mean. Now, where they've struggled so far this season, this has not been a good rebounding team in NC State. And specifically, they've been a horrible defensive rebounding team. They're barely inside the top 300 in terms of defensive rebound rate. Now, they do send teams to the free throw line a decent amount. I'm also skeptical on their 2-point defense. It currently ranks 125th, which you would look at and say, okay, there's 360-ish, 370 teams, something like that. So if you're in the top 180, like 180 is just kind of like average nationally. If you're like 125, that at least puts you you're at least like above average. You're okay at 2-point defense. But then go back to the idea that 6 of their 7 wins were against teams outside of the top 200 on KenPom. Overall, their schedule on KenPom ranks 305th for toughest schedule in the country. So I do think that if you're 125th in 2-point defense against the 305th schedule, That tells me that maybe if you were playing, the 150th best schedule, maybe you would be closer to average. Maybe you would be closer to below average. And I do think that's something that I'm going to expect Kansas to exploit a little bit in this one. NC State does have the 2-6-10 centers, but it's not a ton of size overall for the Wolfpack. It's guards. It's, at the 4, a couple 6'6" guys. So I think that is something Kansas can exploit a little bit in this one. Now, the importance of the game, talked about this earlier. You can't lose three straight. You just can't. You can't lose in Allen Fieldhouse. Start turning your season around after a really bad week last week and make people feel like this was the team that beat Duke and North Carolina and Michigan State from the first 7 games of the season. All right, let's continue on matchups of the game. This is Locked On Jayhawks. This episode of the show is brought to you by Game Time, where you can get tickets for the Kansas NC State game. And Game Time has a new feature called Game Time Picks that makes getting tickets to your favorite, see your team, to see a comedy event, to see theater, whatever it is that you're looking to go to, you can do that easier with Game Time. And I say easier because they have the seat views where you get a panoramic view from your seat, so you know exactly what seat you're getting into. And I'm looking at tickets right now on the Game Time app. I'm looking at with the Game Time picks turned on. I also have my all-in pricing turned on where I don't have to worry about getting a surprise via checkout. And I'm looking right now, and there's a $75 Section 10, row 26. So you can get into the game for that or find exactly where you want to sit and take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time picks. Download the Game Time app, create an account. If you haven't used it before, use the code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. So that's instead of $75, that's $55. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONCollege, LOCKEDONCOLLEGE for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Game Time. All right, continuing on this episode of Locked On Jayhawks, what are our matchups for the game? Number 1, hold on to the ball. NC State's 4 worst turnover defense games this season, they are minus 15 in point differential, so on average about minus 4. In their best 6 turnover rate defensive games this season, they are unbeaten, and they are plus 108, which is an average of plus 18 per game if the math off the top of my head works out there. So they're a team that likes to force turnovers. They thrive on it. Kansas has actually been good here. Kansas has actually been good at avoiding turnovers. I know we just saw the Missouri game where it wanted to make you gouge your eyes out watching all the turnovers, but overall this season, even with that game, Kansas ranks 82nd percentile nationally in offensive turnover rate. What's crazy is that Mizzou game was just so bad. I looked at it. So it was over a 30% turnover rate in what Kansas had in that one game. So basically 3 in every 10 possessions were turnover for KU against Missouri. That was the highest KU game for turnover rate offensively in the last 3 seasons. So yes, it was an uncharacteristically high turnover game, but maybe that makes you think that they're going to be okay because typically over the course of the season, they've been good at it. But still, NC State thrives here. They average 17.4 points off turnovers per game. That's in the 87th percentile nationally. So they're one of the best teams in the country at scoring off turnovers. They also rank in the 99th percentile. So they are literally one of the best teams in the country at 19.4 fast break points per game. They are in the 100th percentile, so the best of their points that come from fast break scoring. So if you take those 19.4 fast break points per game and, figure what percentage does that make up of their overall scoring, it's a huge part of their game. So you have to limit their transition. You have to get back defensively in transition. But one of the easiest ways to avoid transition buckets, it's good shot selection, which that one is a little bit worrisome here because we haven't seen KU have great shot selection recently. But it's also just avoiding turnovers. It's also, avoiding giving up those steals that lead to an easy run out there. So avoid having those dumb turnovers. Play clean. Don't play sloppy. Number 2, crash the offensive glass. This is far from a strength for this Kansas team. But if ever there were a time for them to be better at it, it would be a game like this. So right now, Kansas is only 35th percentile in offensive rebound rate. I think they're only 34th percentile in offensive rebounds per game. All 3 of NC State's losses are their 3 worst defensive rebounding rate games of the season. Now, small sample size, 10 games, haven't played a ton of great opponents, but still, they rank 295th in defensive rebound rate. That's very bad. They're opening the door for you to get extra possessions and dominate here. So do it. Right? They're opening the door. They're saying, come into our house. We are having an open house. Please grab these offensive rebounds from us. And Kansas, unfortunately, this season has been like, nah, we'll go to maybe we'll stop by later today. And then they don't come back. This game, stop by the open house. Try the cookies. I don't know, what happens at open houses? Do you have free beer? I don't know, whatever. Enjoy the open house if you're Kansas. Get those offensive rebounds. And so for that reason, like, I wonder if Flory Badunga plays a big role in this game because he's maybe KU's best offensive rebounder when you look at it there. So that'll be interesting. Okay, number 3, Kansas converting their push shots and their floaters. Teams are starting to pack the paint against Kansas. This goes back to the Creighton game. Missouri replicated a bit. And so for Kansas, you're going to have to it's not just about making threes. It's also, you got to make those mid-range shots, the 5 to 10 footers, a little bit more consistently. The irony is that when teams were not packing the paint as much in the first portion of the season, Kansas was making their 5 to 10 footers. But now that teams with Creighton and Missouri have packed the paint even more, and those 5 to 10 footers have actually been even more open, Kansas is missing them right now. And so overall in the season, Kansas on shots that are in the paint but not are at the rim, so basically in the paint but beyond 4.5 feet from the rim, they're only shooting 40% right now. That's slightly below national average. A big reason why is those last couple of games. NC State's been good at stopping those shots this season. Teams are only shooting 26% against them in that same zone. But assuming they saw the tape and they play a little bit more like Creighton and Missouri, I wonder if they give those up a little bit more in this game. Kansas is going to have to start hitting those shots closer to a 45% clip, I think, moving forward to be successful there, in addition to shooting more threes and hitting more threes if they want to kind of overcome some of this court packing that's happening at the other end. We're going to finish up on this preview for KU NC State, get into players to watch and which Hawk we think can soar here. We get to that on the other side. This is Locked On Jayhawks. This is FanDuel Sportsbook, your sponsor for Locked On Jayhawks. You ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook? Because right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL, college football, college basketball, all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. All you got to do, visit FanDuel.com. You can join today. You get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. It's at FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL and the Locked On Podcast Network. Finishing things up on this episode of the show with some players to watch for the KU NC State game. And we will have a post-game recap of the KU NC State game. I'll be doing some broadcasting on Saturday, so it might come out later on Saturday for you, maybe even Sunday for the KU NC State game. But it will be out at some point over your weekend after the game. And don't forget, you can check out some of our other Locked On shows talking about KU football offseason. That's been, wild and crazy so far to this point in a good way. And you can also check out Locked On College Football or Locked On College Basketball. All right, players to watch in this one. Our player matchup, I'm going to go with, because when I look at the point guard matchup, like Michael O'Connell, Dwan Harris, those are more two kind of like game manager types. I don't really know who's going to be starting at the 2 and 3 for Kansas. Like, you could convince me. Bill Self says, you know what, I know I'm going to give you guys a longer leash. Rylan Griffen, AJ Storr, I'm putting you into the starting lineup. We're going to see what happens. You can convince me we see Coit and Zeke Mayo again. It becomes harder for me to pick the 2 and 3s as matchups, even though for them, their 2 and 3s are basically putting up collective 25 points per game. So I'm going to go with Dontrez Styles against KJ Adams. You have a 6'6" wing in Styles, who's a good athlete. You have a 6'7" wing, big man type, I guess, whatever you want to call him, in KJ Adams. And Styles is one of their top offensive guys. He's efficient, but he struggles defensively. He has been their worst defender so far this season, according to Evan Miyakawa. In fact, Styles is a negative defensive BPR. That is not good. You do not want to be in the negatives. He's the only negative on the team. Everybody else is the very least in the positive. So can KJ take advantage? Because if NC State packs the paint, does it matter that that guy is not as good of a defender? Because he is averaging 1.1 blocks per game. And so if you take away him having to really guard one-on-one, and now he's just a help side rim protector, shot blocker, that's really bad for KU. So KJ needs to find a way to be successful on the offensive end in this one. Then on the defensive end, can you kind of take Styles out of the game defensively? Because again, he's averaging almost 11 points per game in 24 minutes per game. Can you slow him down? Can you make him more minute inefficient? I think that'll be a fun matchup between those two players. All right, we're changing things around. We do Hawks to Soar. We do that in football. We've been doing offense and defense. We do that for football and then basketball as well. We're just going to change this to high on the go-off meter. Somebody who I think has a higher chance to maybe go off relative in this game, right? Go off can be different for player to player, right? Going off for DeJuan Harris could be 14 points. Going off for Hunter Dickinson, what's that, like 25 points? I don't know. So player I actually think is set up to have a good game in this one. I'm going to go with AJ Storr. Now, am I a little bit concerned about some of the potential, I don't know, locker room issues that a lot of people have kind of alluded to? A little bit. Am I worried about Bill Self's usage of Storr and maybe the lack of long leash that he's gotten? Yeah, a little bit. Am I worried about the, not great shot selection at times for Storr that could lead to some easy runouts and that lethal transition offense for NC State? Yes, I am worried. Why am I picking him to be on the go-off meter? Well, here's why. If he's in at the 4, right, if KJ takes a seat on the bench and you put Storr at the 4, as I mentioned, Styles not a great defender. I think you can take advantage of that. If Storr is in at the 3, you look at NC State, they play a lot of 3-guard lineups. You're going to see a lot of a 6'4" guard who's more of a true guard type at the 3. And I think Storr, yeah, maybe it's only an inch or two advantage in terms of his height, but I think he's a much more physical player and plays at a much more physical level when you look at his offensive ability to kind of get downhill and attack powerfully to the rim on a straight line drive. I think he'll be able to attack on NC State's smaller guards. So despite some of those worries, I'm going to say this is a game that AJ Storr is set up to go off, but also who knows? Because right now things feel very much in the air in a lot of ways for KU. That'll do it for this episode of Locked On Jayhawks. We'll be back later this weekend to give you a recap of KU NC State. Who knows? Maybe there'll be some breaking news that pops in between then and now, and we'll get to it when we get to it. See you next time on LOJ.